Welcome back to Guess What Day It Is. Today we're going to talk about hoarding. So before we get started on today's video, this video is not a substitute for professional help. I'm not an expert in the field. If you have a loved one or you yourself are suffering from hoarding disorder, please seek out the help of a professional. With that being said, so there's a lot of things on this channel that you see on a weekly basis that I say have come from my dad's collection. Or I say things like, my dad was a collector of many things. That's kind of a kind way of me saying that my dad suffered from hoarding disorder. So I'm going to show you a video, or a couple videos here, of what the basement of my parents' house looked like just a little bit over a year ago. Let's take a look at that footage. I apologize for the shakiness of these videos. So, point of reference, the basement is basically a square. This is back to the far corner, which actually has a bit of a kick out where my dad's workbench is. So the stairs led out right to the south side of the house at the furnace. And all there was is just a single path to get to the washer and dryer. There was actually about an inch thick cardboard paper layer on the concrete that we had to clear out to make sure it was safe for my mom to get to the washer and dryer. This next video is kind of an illustration of what little pathway was through the basement. It was pretty sketchy. As you can see, I'm trying to make sure I have a good footing. So, pretty crazy. So what is hoarding disorder? Well, I think we're kind of familiar with it through things like the show Hoarders. I believe it was on A&E for a fair amount of time. I think it still might be going as we speak. That's kind of a good representation of the struggle of somebody going through hoarding disorder and how it can affect the family. So according to the American Psychiatric Association, the persistent difficulty discarding or parting with an item, regardless of the value, because of a perceived need to save that item, its value being more than it really should be, or the pain and suffering of getting rid of that item. So when we think of acquiring things, I love buying things. I'm not a saver by nature. The joy of buying something new, whether that's something from Amazon, going to the store and buying something, there's a rush that comes with that. And with collecting, that can be heightened as well. So finding that last thing to finish off your collection can give you this rush. And the opposite of that is getting rid of an item can cause pain. So that's part of it. So a lot of things kind of play into that. So that's the first aspect of that. So difficulty in getting rid of possessions causes congestion in the house, the inability to use the room for its intended purpose, whether that's a kitchen, a living area, a bedroom, anything along those lines. Eventually it can get bad enough where it can cause damage to the house. If there are a pile of dishes in the sink, that can cause black mold. It can cause plumbing issues as things settle and they're not flushed through the pipes as they're supposed to be. And eventually it gets to the point where somebody needs to come in and do some repair work, whether that be a plumber or a handyman or something along those lines. And that's a very big challenge for somebody who suffers from hoarding disorder, because that means somebody can come in and look at what's going on. That can produce shame, which is somewhat of a trigger for hoarding disorder. And it can also be a fear of that person telling you you need to get rid of these things in order to fix whatever issue there is. And eventually, this progresses into affecting your daily life. That can be anything from not being able to go to work because of certain items, not getting adequate sleep, or because you can't get to your bed, not preparing meals. A lot of times there's contaminants in the air, especially hoarding disorder kind of goes along with hoarding animals as well. And that can put a lot of toxins in the air if the animals are not cared for, and just a general unsafe living condition that can cause many, many health problems, especially for those who are over 60 as they go forward. So there's various degrees of how that hoard can turn out, which I'm not real familiar with that. There was a YouTube channel called Midwest Magic Cleaning. I highly recommend it. It's a great insight into this as well. So check that out. So 2 to 6% of the population suffers from hoarding disorder. It, like we spoke about, generally affects people who are 60 and older. It also statistically affects men more than it does women. So that's kind of interesting. It can also be triggered by trauma. So someone can go through life without exhibiting hoarding disorder, and then someone can pass away, a loved one. There could be a loss of a job. All that can trigger the start of a hoard. So very interesting. And very interesting, especially as I compare it to my experience going forward. So how has this affected me and my family? Obviously, my mom, it affected her greatly. This is something that she had to deal with on a daily basis. There was a bit of a no-go zone for my dad and the things he would collect. There were certain rooms where the hoard was just limited to a certain area, like their bedroom. There were certain rooms that were kind of off limits. That would be the living room and the dining room and the kitchen. And my mom also had the bedroom I used to stay in as kind of a no hoard zone. There was also a bedroom that my kids, as their grandkids, used to spend a lot of time in too, and that was generally fairly uncluttered. But the family room was terrible. But the worst part was the basement. So as you saw in those pictures earlier, it was almost impossible for me to get anywhere into the basement. So as we've gone through the cleanup process, we've kind of discovered it's kind of like cutting down a tree and looking at the different rings that tell how old the tree is. They also can tell you how severe the environment was during the years of those rings. Disassembling a hoard is kind of like that as well. So my memory of the basement, this is kind of the primary area. I learned how to ride a bike in the basement, so it was clear enough that I could, ride around the basement. It was a fairly good-sized basement. I learned how to roller skate down there. We had a workout area, and I used to use the weight equipment that my dad had. We used to have dinner down there sometimes. And of course, when friends would come over or anything like that, we would basically go down the basement, and that's where a lot of my stuff was. So it was very, very livable for most of my life. My dad is a collector. He loved railroad memorabilia. The family room is still to this day filled with some of that, and some of that will be coming to us, and we will get that into our antique booth as well. He loved to go to garage sales and buy stuff, which is something that we always did throughout my life. We used to actually ride bikes to garage sales when I was a kid. I remember my dad buying a gas lamp that would be in the front yard, large pole with a big lamp, strapped the lamp to the back of his bicycle and basically just held the pole. Looked like he was jousting or something like that. It's pretty interesting. But, that stuff would come, and it didn't really get out of hand too much until when I was about 12 or 13 years old. My grandma passed away. My grandma, upon reflection, was a tough lady. She trying to say this in a very gentle way, was ruled with a very strong fist when it came to my dad's life and my aunt's life. So there was an extreme amount of guilt that came around my dad when my grandma passed away. We went on a youth trip around the same time as when she went in the hospital, and I remember quite the guilt trip. I was pretty young, so I didn't really quite understand what was going, but at least I was aware of what was happening. So she did eventually pass away, and I think that's kind of when the hoard started. So fast forward, about that time in the early 90s, my dad started his own TV repair business. He basically took it over from the original owner and continued to run the business until the late 90s. And that was a big change in his life. So he worked on TVs for 35, 40 years, however long it was at that point. And he had to find something else to do. There was a lot of conflict between me and him because of, I just think that was outworking of his frustration with not knowing what the next step in his life was going to be. I think that looking at the different situations in the basement, you can almost pinpoint that as being another point where that kind of ramped up. The next part of that would be a series of health issues that kind of came across a pretty nasty bout with diverticulitis that required surgery. It also had a infection that was very tricky. It involved a back procedure that brought in some bacteria. It ended up making him very sick. It actually attacked his heart. It attacked his pancreas. He had to have his heart valve replaced with a pig valve, and that is another thing that started to accelerate the hoard as it went forward. The next thing was my aunt passing away. There's a lot of trauma that kind of went on with their family, and as time has passed, been able to reflect on that, my aunt never really got to go off on her own. She lived next door to my parents on her own, but that was after my grandpa passed away when I was 16 years old. So my aunt pretty much had to support my grandma and grandpa. She didn't get to go off and get married. She didn't get to go off and start a life of her own. And I think there was a great deal of guilt that my dad had that she never really got to partake in the things that he was lucky enough to partake in. I think that was another traumatic thing that accentuated the hoard. Once again, it's kind of evident as we've gone through that. And then two things that kind of coincide with each other. COVID happened, which is a very scary time, especially for somebody who's in their late 70s or early 80s. My dad, working on TVs, always had a TV on and just absorbed a lot of that. And one of the tragedies of COVID is isolation. So my dad, after he retired from being a TV repairman, became very involved with the city of Hazelwood, which is where I grew up, Hazelwood, Missouri, as a volunteer police officer, and he was also a code enforcement agent for quite a while. Several times a week, he volunteered with the police department doing various things around the police house, and that shut down. During COVID, none of that was a possibility. Probably, in hindsight, a little bit of an overreach, but at the time, I think everybody was looking out for the best interests of anyone in my parents' age group, for sure. The problem with that is my dad suffered from dementia, and it accelerated greatly. So the brain is something that needs to be exercised on a regular basis. And my dad's cognitive skills got worse and worse because he didn't have that drive and that purpose that he had. Even though he was just volunteering, that was such an integral part of his existence. Without that, it just kind of accelerated the dementia. And as the dementia continued to get worse, the hoard progressed to a point where the basement was pretty much unpassable, as well as the family room getting to the point where you really could get to just the spots where the chairs were that my parents sat on. So it's a very interesting thing to dismantle this hoard. You cut through, the first part of our dismantling was getting through loads of trash. And you saw in that first part of the video me climbing over stuff. It was just junk. There was cardboard on the floor that was probably 1.5 inches thick. It was soft. It was rubbery. There was no visible concrete really in that basement, and it's not finished. There was just enough of a path for my dad to get to the washer and dryer, because my mom didn't do laundry. She was not about to go through that, and she basically told my dad, "You're going to have to do it." And so it just got to the point where that trash was there. And I do believe that trash was part of the later part of the hoard. I think it just got so out of hand that my dad just didn't know what to do with it. And there were times where he would come up from trying to get that basement cleaned, and he would apologize to my mom. He wouldn't say what for, but I think it's because he knew that he had to do something about it, but either he didn't know where to start, or it was just so overwhelming, he really couldn't do anything about it. So that's something that is very, very interesting. I've had to kind of come to grips with that. And as far as my grieving of my dad, because there was a lot of anger involved on my part, I have to deal with this. My mom wants to move. That's not going to be able to happen until we get this under control. And it takes a lot of time and effort on my part and on the part of many, many volunteers that have been gracious enough to help us with this. Shout out to the Hazelwood Police Department, especially to Shane and Andy. If you're watching this, thank you very much. I appreciate it. But understanding the pain that he had, knowing that he couldn't do anything about this, allows me to have a little bit more compassion on him, and ultimately to forgive him for everything that had come about because of this. For the most part, my dad was a great dad. As a dad now, none of us do this perfectly. It is a hard thing. There's books out there, but they don't really help. Don't read them. They'll just mess you up more. Just remember that. But some of the things that I decided to do towards the end of my dad's life was to not focus on the hoard. What I chose to do is, with the limited amount of time I knew we had, was just to enjoy my dad the best that I could, to hear the stories and try to soak them up as much as I could. If I tried to confront him on that, I don't know if this is the right answer or not, but I think it would have damaged our relationship to the point where I may not have had the opportunity to enjoy those last few years. And for the most part, they were pretty good. So I am thankful for that. One thing I also decided to do was to support my mom as much as I could when it came to anything that she needed in the background, which is very challenging when it comes to not angering my dad and all that kind of stuff. With a lot of that, we couldn't throw anything away. If you're familiar with hoarding, it's pretty tough to take something and throw it away without them noticing it. It does cause a lot of strife and anger. So it is tough. It is extremely tough. So if you or someone you love is struggling with hoarding disorder, I understand that. But there's people out there that can help. And I encourage you to get help from a professional. Once again, that's not me. But I've been where you are. Mental health is something that, especially my generation, Gen X, we just push stuff down. We just push it down, push it farther down. Don't worry about it. It's fine. That doesn't work. Professional help is as easy as accessing a lot of the online counseling that's out there. I'm not associated with any of those, so I can't give you advice on who to reach out to. But by all means, reach out to somebody if you can. So 2 takeaways that I came away from this. You got to have compassion for the person. This isn't just for hoarding disorder. We are called to love our neighbor. And that means that we have compassion on them. Somebody that is suffering from hoarding disorder does not need to be told they're disgusting. They do not need to be told that this is something that I would never let happen. That doesn't help them. You have to have compassion on them and understand that there's probably a great deal of trauma that is stemming and all this is bubbling up from. That's something that we need to do in every aspect of our life. Have compassion on people. So the second takeaway is forgiveness. Forgiveness has been something that has been a process for me. I have decided to forgive my dad for the hoard. He didn't ask for forgiveness, but through my compassion and understanding on how broken he was, it just causes me to have more love and the ability to forgive him for that as well. So what I have chosen to do is to turn his hoard into this YouTube channel, into this new venture with my son and I when we're selling the things that he collected over the years. So what I have chosen to do is to honor him through that. And hopefully this video honors him as well. So it's a little bit of a different video, right? We're going to usually talk about the business or cool stuff that we've got going in the booth. But I thought it was a good opportunity to take a step back and to talk about this kind of stuff because I think that 2 to 6% is light. I think there's a lot of folks that are dealing with this. And especially as the boomers age, that's going to be something that we're going to have to deal with. So remember to have compassion and to speak with the person and think about forgiving them for what they're doing. So thank you for watching. We're going to look at some of the videos of the progress we've made in the basement. I'll try to clip in some pictures of before and after as I can. We're making some pretty good progress. So thank you again for watching. Please share this with a friend that might be suffering with a loved one that has hoarding disorder. Or maybe you got a little bit of comfort from this. So take a second to go back and watch some of our other videos where we take some of this stuff and we turn it into some fun and some business opportunities. We have videos on Wednesday where we go over the business aspect. We show how our booth looks, all the changes we've made, the sales that we've made, and how much we've made or lost. So we also have videos on Friday, which involve individual items that I go through here on the workbench and make sure that they work and then put them out on the floor. So like and subscribe. And thank you again for watching. Guess what day it is? So this video is taken after we had about 15 volunteers from the Hazelwood Police Department and other volunteers that are associated with Hazelwood. Super thankful for those guys. Couldn't have done it without them, but much improvement. It doesn't seem like a lot. We wanted to get this furnace freed up. There was just a ton of food sitting there that obviously needed to go. Very old. So we made a little bit of headway here. We're able to uncover kind of a pathway back to the south side of the basement. We were able to get to these 2 freezers that were chock full of frozen meat. We wanted to get the freezers open so we could get the meat out and thrown away. Not much progress to get back to that corner of the basement. We also had to get to the water meter, which was on that little kick out to the right there where the workbench is, but much improved. We filled up an entire, I believe it was a 30-yard dumpster getting all this stuff out. So amazing how much stuff. You see there's a path as we get back to the south side. So this was kind of where my dad spent a lot of his time before it got like this, obviously. He liked to kind of come down here and use the weight bench, which is completely covered. There's the weight bench there as well. And lots of stuff. We're starting to get to the point where we see another one of those rings, another layer of stuff. So this video is after a second round of volunteers that we had. We filled up another big dumpster. As you can see, we can make it all the way over to the workbench without too much of a problem. There's basically a clear pathway around the entire basement at this point. It does take a little bit to get back to this south side, but you can see we've stripped away the trash. Now there's a fair amount of organization. If you look deep enough, if you look at that back wall, there's some oscilloscopes. There's actually a stack of older tube radios. This is where Christmas stuff is and all that kind of stuff. Got a large section cleared out between the washer and dryer, all the way basically to where the weight bench was. You can see the weight bench right there in the middle. Significant progress. Once again, lots of volunteer help with this. Very thankful. This area is where most of the stereo equipment was found. So this was, once again, one of the older layers where my dad was kind of collecting things, not necessarily hoarding. A little bit better back here, not much. It's at least somewhat passable to get back in this little area. But at least we can get around the entire basement now. This section is going to be the next challenge as well. So on the other side of those boxes is the underside of the stairs, to give you kind of a point of reference. We're coming back, going to the north side, back by the tool bench area. This video is after just a couple hours in the basement, just by myself. I actually made some progress. It doesn't look like it. This is the workbench. There's a bunch of stuff still over there. So this area is kind of a staging area for some of the stuff that we're going to take back and sell. Not much change over here. But quite a bit of change in the center. There was a big cabinet that I was able to break up and basically just take out. Now we're down to kind of the original layer. A lot of the beer signs and collectibles that my dad had. Clear view of the weight bench. A lot of the stuff in the center is just stuff that needed to be thrown out, so it looks a little more cluttered. There's a couple nice turntables right there in the middle of the aisle. There's still some food hanging from the ceiling back here. There's some canned food, some pasta, dry goods, but making progress. Some of the stuff back here is actually some of my stuff from when I was a kid. Not much has changed on the opposite side. Really trying to focus on this area and then kind of work counterclockwise throughout the basement. More turntables. A lot of this stuff is still pretty organized. There you can see that's the underside of the staircase. Quite a bit of stuff over here that needs to be gone through. I think that the items that are in this area are actually nicer. So we might have quite a few items that we can resell. Got a lot of the stained glass lights that you see there. Vintage luggage, which is actually kind of worth some money. Oscilloscopes. And back there, that's kind of the original line of shelving. And as you can see, there's not much really back there. So once we can get back there and just clear all that out, it's not going to take very much. Probably a broom would make this look a lot better as well. So this video is from this past weekend. Made some more progress on this side. This area by the furnace is kind of a staging area, so a lot of that stuff is going to make it home so that we can put in our antique booth. We found a bunch of cast iron weights. There's probably 2,500 pounds worth of weight there, which is crazy. That was just all scattered all over the place. We got this opened up. The weight bench is gone. Got almost all the way to that back wall. This shelf is filled with things that we're going to be taking home once again. So the challenge is kind of pulling out the good stuff and throwing away the bad stuff and trying to keep organized with that. So, well, that's going to do it for this episode of Guess What Day It Is. It's a much different video than what you're probably used to on this channel. I just wanted to give you kind of a backstory on where a lot of our stuff comes from and how we're trying to take a situation that was very challenging and try to turn it into something that's a benefit. So we'll keep you posted on our progress. Remember to hit like and subscribe. Share this with your friends, especially if they're going through something similar. And we'll see you next time on Guess What Day It Is.